Welcome to Story Hour, a virtual meetup hosted by Wolf and Heron.
Arman, the stage is yours.
Yeah, so I actually want to talk about a story that happened to me, a personal experience that happened to me very recently. On January 9th, 2020, just a couple months ago, I was on my way to work. I carpool. I live in Ann Arbor and I commute to Detroit, so it's a 1-hour carpool every day. And I usually listen to books and podcasts and stuff like that. And like a very typical day, that's what I was doing that day. And I got a text message from my mom, who's back in Iran. And she said, well, did you hear about that airplane that crashed? That was shot basically by this missile this morning. And I said, yeah, about it. That's so unfortunate. I was like, yeah, I heard about it. And then she said, well, people say that there are rumors that it has been done by the Iranian government. And then I was like, oh my God, Mom, come on. These rumors, there's so many social channels that you're on that you should not be. All these people spreading rumors and random information. 9 out of 10 kind of messages that I get from my mom are like that. So I kind of ignored that. And she was like, well, did you have any friends on that airplane? Because a lot of those people were really brilliant folks from the university that I come from. And hundreds of people were potentially your former classmates. And then I was like, no, Mom, I don't think anyone was there. And then she said, okay, she sent me a text right after, and it had the name of the 250 people who were on that flight. And I got really nervous, and I kind of scrolled up and started looking at 250 names, and I was looking for a couple of familiar names, and I actually came across a name that it just shocked me. As I'm telling it, I'm getting goosebumps right now. And I saw one of my best friend's names there from my college time back in Iran. And he and his wife were on that airplane, essentially coming back from a wedding that they were from Canada. They went back to Iran to get married, to see one of our other friends getting married. And then they were on that flight. And I kind of experienced every single phase that psychologists say it happens in your brain when you get a bad news. I was like, oh no, that's not real. Oh, that's not true. And then I was thinking about it. I was like, no, that is true. It's all the news media are talking about it, and it has happened. And then I was like, well, having these different emotions that, well, I mean, things happen. Maybe that has been the case. And then thinking about all the good memories that we had, I was like, well, how should I respond? What should I do? And then essentially I thought that I can do it. I was like, I'm going to go to work today, and then when I get back home, I can think about it and mourn and connect with my friends. And I think that was the worst decision I've made, that I thought I can. So I went to office, and I had so many meetings that day. And I remember in between those calls, I would go to this side office, this room that we have, and essentially cry without even being able to control my emotions. And then I would wash my face and go back to normal and chit chat with everyone, go to the next meeting, manage the clients, and then go back during my lunch break to that room. I was like, I don't understand it, going through all of the memories that we had from undergrad. We spent years together. We had 2 patents registered together. So we spent so much time working on this project together. And essentially in the middle of the day, I called it a day and said, I can't, I'm going to go home. I talked to my boss, and she said, why you didn't tell me earlier? Why are you in the office? Go home, do whatever you need to do. And I can tell those couple days were so difficult, thinking about all of these emotions, all these good memories that was coming in front of my eye. And my whole social media channels were filled with essentially all of our friends sharing photos, sharing videos from a wedding that happened 2 nights before that, and how beautiful these 2 people were. And something that I experienced through that time, I learned a big lesson, I would say, from all of those feelings that I experienced, the anger. And I was angry at the government. I was angry at the US government for doing these things to Iran, so Iran has to respond this way. I was angry at, Iranian government, at a lot of things. I started hating, having strong feelings started And one thing that I remember going through this experience was I came across a beautiful quote from someone saying, don't let your anger make you hate, because that's how hate generates more hate. And that has been a kind of a guiding principle for me since then. When I get really angry at something, I feel like, yeah, that is a strong feelings. I'm angry at this or at this person, but I don't want to allow me to hate, to create more hate in this world. So that's my story.
Thank you, Arman. Thank you. That was another great story. So let's talk about first what Arman did really well with his story.
I can go.
Yeah, go ahead.
So I don't want to get too tactical, but I think firstly, again, thank you for sharing your story. But what was really interesting about it is it reminded for me, and it surfaced for me, the power of story in helping you both process and understand what you processed. Sometimes we talk to people, and storytelling, sharing stories and listening to stories can be very therapeutic, because it helps us to, in a way, re-experience what we already experienced, and it helps other people relate to the experience that we had and develop empathy for us. Mm-hmm. And so if the theme is engage emotion, or the focus for today, I think you did that very well. And then how you did that well was by A, the courage to share it, and then B, the willingness to just share where you are, because obviously you mentioned you had not prepared that, and so it was basically just coming straight from your heart through your head as you're processing it, and because of that, in a way, we were able to be there along with you. So I think that is an advantage, in a way, of having an unrehearsed, unpracticed, unanticipated story. And so well done.
Thanks.
Other thoughts, Maggie, Doug? What did Arman do really well?
I felt like he put me in the driver's seat of his story. So, when he was scrolling through his phone, he was making the hand gestures. He was saying, "I literally have goosebumps saying this right now," and I got cold, And so a lot of the words he used in his story helped me feel that emotion as well. I mean, I was about to cry, and being in that driver's seat, I felt like I could feel a small part of what he went through this hard time. I can't imagine, because I haven't experienced that, but I think you did a really great job in pulling like the empathy that I had. You've created empathy from me with sharing the story and how you did it.
Yeah, Arman, I want to second Maggie. I actually circled the word goosebumps because I felt them. As soon as you said it, I felt it. And that really just reiterates for me the power of being able to actually describe the physiology of your emotional experience, because it's when you describe the physiology that we then, as the audience, can feel it too. So I actually circled it because I was like, yes, check mark, really nicely done. I thought that was really cool. The other thing I liked that I thought was really powerful were that you did have a few concrete scenes: sitting in the car on your way to Detroit, getting a text message, right? That's a scene. I can see you on the highway. I can see you getting a text message as you're in your carpool. And so like that was a thing. And then the scene of like the side room in the office where you went to go and just like release your emotional experience. Like there were these moments that were really powerful along the way. And by giving us the description that allows us to see what the space is around you, allows us to put ourselves in the context, which I thought was really well done. Other thoughts?
I just want to thank you for sharing. I really appreciate it. It brought up a lot of memories for me. I think that the specificity of the moments were really powerful. So they may have been stream of consciousness, like videos, just little pieces, but just echoing the scene setting. I think that those would be things that in a rehearsed thing might get lost, but were, I think, extraordinarily powerful. And then this is sort of, I guess, contradictory to what you were saying to Maggie, but like, I appreciate you were specific without over-explaining how you were feeling. And I think it allowed us to insert our own feelings and our own, how we would react to situations like that. So you were able to convey it, but without like telling us how we should be feeling.
Excellent. Thank you, everyone.
That's great. All right. What about things that Arman can experiment with? Since this was the first telling, an unrehearsed telling, what could Arman experiment with to play with it and see if the story can take new shape? I'm going to go off theme. We talked about engage emotion as our theme, but I'm actually going to go off theme with a thought. I thought you did come to a place in your story where you had a clear point. Your theme shows up, this idea of don't let anger turn to hate, because that's what creates more hate in the world, kind of thing. And I think with that theme in mind, now that you've told it once, how could you thread it starting earlier? It felt almost like it was kind of a surprise ending in some ways. I was like, okay, I get it. I get that how that is the lesson that you learned. But what I would have liked to see were more kind of foreshadowing or like drops of the word anger and hate starting earlier in your story, so that it echoes. And by the time I get to the end, I totally understand your evolution, if that makes sense. That would be something to play with as a thought. And I'm sure actually the more that you process this story, the more that you're going to identify other potential themes as well. This is one of those stories that it's ripe for a lot of different learning experiences, if that's what you want to call it. You'll probably be able to recycle it for a lot of different themes. And with that in mind, you can think about how you want to end your story when you start, so that you can carry that through.
Mm-hmm. Do you have, so that's a very good feedback, because I actually put a note and I say I usually try to have stories that they do have a so what at the end of the story, right? Not just describing a lot of things that happened to me. So I usually try to end with a learning point, if you recall from my previous story as well. But yeah, I don't know exactly how. Do you have any specific feedback in terms of where in the story I could have added, or how should I have done that?
So with this particular theme, this concept of don't let anger turn to hate, I think it's interesting to play with, when you're at work. A lot of what I see when I see people do theme really well is actually just echoing the same words over and over in different contexts throughout your story. So could you, for example, while you're in your in that office room, crying uncontrollably, could you start to, in that moment, experience the hate and feel things that you want to do or say, or, and then and the conflict of that, like, is this something that you want to do? Right. And if you start to use this, like, I was angry, and then the anger of evolving, right? Especially because you talk about, you experienced all the phases of bad news, like what you experience when you get bad news. But anger is one of those phases. And so rather than saying I experienced all the phases, talk about being stuck in that one. And I think that could, play with ways that you can focus on the anger that you're experiencing throughout and how that's starting to evolve into hatred, And then what happens when you see that quote and the kind of revelation, oh my God, this is what I've been doing. This isn't who I want to be. I don't want to contribute to hate in the world. Like, I need to take a step back, right? And maybe that's where you move from anger into the next phase.
This is very helpful. Thank you. Any other feedback on
Other
things that I
thoughts?
could improve?
Anyone on the engage emotion theme, since that is our theme for today?
I just was thinking similarly to Stephanie that it is such a strong emotional experience, the story, what was going on for you, that it would really depend on who are you speaking to and what do you want to communicate with them. Like, I think that is the biggest thing for this type of a story, because it could have an impact on, maybe who you want to share it with is another family member or a friend or somebody who knew the friend that you're describing in the story. And then you want to actually get even deeper than you did with us. Maybe it's a work colleague or an employee of yours that's going through a similar experience, and you want to relate it to whatever they're experiencing. I think it really just depends on the context and the audience and how you might then shift what you're sharing based on that, and it might be completely not about the theme that you guys just worked through a little bit just then. It might be more about, we'll get through this, give it time. There could be a gajillion things that would be relevant from an experience like that. And I think it just depends on, who are you speaking to? Where are they at? Why are you communicating the story to them? And what do you want to share?
Yeah.
Makes sense.
You did a good job of telling a 5-minute story. If you had more time, one experiment you might try actually is to have a vignette of your time in college with this person, so that we better understand your relationship with him. Or even more of the vignettes or the emotional experience of seeing the fact that he got married 2 or 3 days ago. Right. And what does that mean for you in your processing of all this? You only had 5 minutes, so there wasn't time to do all that. But if you have space for more, those are other things that could help to bring the weight of the loss in a little bit more dramatically for the audience.
Very good point. Very, very good point. Is there any way to turn the story to positive? When I was telling the story, I was like, I don't want to make everyone feel these negative feelings. But I was thinking about it, but my creativity didn't help. On the spot, I couldn't turn it into a super positive thing at the end. Many good stories have to end in a positive note.
Adding uplift to your story can be something, and I think this kind of speaks to Kara's first comment about sometimes the storytelling process and the story crafting process is in and of itself very therapeutic, and it is through the telling and retelling that you will find the uplift. Sometimes you haven't lived long enough to experience the uplift yet. And sometimes it just takes time to process and see, and Kara was already hinting at, is there maybe a story of things can be hard, but we will get through it, right? Is that your story? Or, loss happens, but we find community as a result, right? And I don't know, you have to kind of live a little bit into this story a little bit longer to know and experience what the positive is, that will come. I think it's hard to force. It just sort of happens.
Yeah, no, very, very good point. I don't want to dominate, but I got an idea, because after that, the whole community became so much closer. So we have a group of 15, 20 people from college, but now we spend 9-hour Skype calls on Saturday, Sunday.
Wow.
So we are now in constant touch. We know all the ins and outs of everyone's life. And back in Iran, people stay up till 6 a.m. from the night before. So we Skype all overnight. So I think that could be the positive uplift
there's
element.
something, right? And now you have a story that's not about anger and hate. It's about, community and how loss brings people together, right? Exactly. So you have this same story can have multiple themes, and you can play with a lot of different possibilities.
We have also seen, some people are afraid to share a content heavy story if they're not feeling that heavy, but they're worried that the audience is going to just feel like it's so serious and so heavy. And they do have to be at a place past it to then give the audience permission to not sit in that heavy space. But if they are, and they have perspective and distance from it, what people might do is actually inject a little bit of some of that perspective and or humor throughout. What humor can do is if you're building tension or building heaviness for a period of time, adding humor, and I'm not talking about like a joke, but like just a moment of humor can release the tension, and that can help to make it so people aren't sitting and your audience isn't sitting in just this like this like heavy sad space for that period of time. Right. You can help them come in and out of that and show them basically earlier on in the story that you're okay now, obviously, right? And you're giving them permission to see that you're okay.
Yeah. Very good point. Yeah, I'm sorry if I made you feel that way.
No, it's good. Yeah, well, and like I want to say that it's not a bad story to have your audience feel, right? Like that is the point, right? And so we as audience members, especially if you're telling a story in the context of, if I think about a story showcase or the Moth events or something where there's many, many stories that are told, like absolutely let your story be dark if that's where it should be, and the audience, like that is part of the journey of being an audience member, is to be in all of the emotions. We are human. We experience all of them. And so, yes. And then Kara's point of the humor is a great release of tension. So when you're in a space where people are kind of like, oh, I'm a little uncomfortable, you feel the audience members starting to shift in their seats, then you inject a moment of self-deprecation. I actually, the comment about your mom and her conspiracy theories and all the rumors that she pays attention to, like that was kind of funny, right? And so there's like an opportunity for you to kind of be like, oh, mom, right? And like you can actually, then the audience goes, okay, we're being funny again. And it lets people kind of like, it's an escape valve for the sort of darker emotions. Other thoughts? Doug and Maggie, do you want to say anything? Opportunities to experiment?
So I don't know if this is out of line or out of bounds, but there's a framework. It's called Me, We, Now, or Us, I, Us, and like current. And I think that you hit on all those, especially when you started to tie it together at the end about what's meaningful at the end. It doesn't have to be positive. It could be what's meaningful, and land it that way. Yeah. But you touched on all those elements. Why is this personal to you? Well, how does it connect to us? And then what's happening now? And those three components can be played with at any time. This comes from a campaign background. So there's often a call to action, which like if you're imparting a lesson, there's probably a call to action, but it could also be like just what's happening. It doesn't have to be so much like an ask, although of course you could transition it. But I think that framework has been really helpful for me in terms of how to craft stories. And you hit on all of those things, especially when you sort of, that reflection of the wonderful community that's been created now.
Yeah. Can you talk a little bit, Doug, about Me, We, Now? What is that?
Yeah, so it's basically comes from Marshall Gans. So he's a theorist on like organizing principles that the Obama campaigns used, and that's part of my background. And so if you look through a lot of his speeches, it's a story of myself, how I connect to the community, and then what action needs to take now. So when you're thinking about their campaign messages that usually followed that. So that's also been applied the other way. It's story of self. So you have your story of self, the story of us, and the story of now. And so you shared those things. You started with yourself, Arman, then you started about talking about now, and you brought the community in about connecting with people. Yeah. And so that sort of general framework, and those can happen in any order. In fact, you played around with that in your order. Like, this is happening now. This is current for me. Here's what it means for me. Here's what it means for the community. And then coming back to the now again at the end. So you can play with those components, but those arcs and narratives, or those components, were all there. And I thought that was really positive. Yeah. That was the piece I was going to share, is around the, and actually Karen and Stephanie both talked about this too. So I didn't want to undercut what they were saying, but yeah, you can pull out different threads within it. But it doesn't have to be positive inherently. There's lots of different ways to ground.
That's great. Thank you.
Thanks, Doug. This is really, really helpful, because I usually try, that's my intention for telling a story, especially being an Iranian in the US. In many times I try to educate people who may not be as aware about that. So I usually try to use these personal stories about what does it mean to not see my family for 5 years, or what does it mean to be like an Iranian in a country that people hate Iranians. So I usually try to do that, but I think that was a pretty good reminder that I can spin it in a way that just say, hey guys, let's stop. We don't need to hate. A lot of people are suffering in between, right? I would love to hear more about this MeWe Now framework. If you have any resources, I would love to review on the side, if you could send it to me.
Yeah, sure. And one other last thing, and then Maggie, I'm sorry, is you did a really great job. I think you read that a lot of us are Americans. So you said, hey, Americans and things. So you kind of did that code switch automatically. You've been practicing that for a very long time, but give yourself credit for making that connection intuitively. Who is the we that you actually want to address? Because I would imagine if you're telling that story to a different audience, potentially Iranian friends, then you might use a different example of who the we is. And you probably take that for granted, but it's worth being aware of from an American's perspective here.
Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, we'll definitely, Doug, you've got homework now. We all want to know more about MeWe Now. So, and we'll send it out to this group, because that would be lovely. That's really cool. Thank you for having structure. And one of the things that we very often get questions about is story structure, and how to put a story framework together. And we always talk about context, conflict, and resolution, because that is kind of the baseline. But this is another kind of framing for how to think about it that can shape what the story ends up becoming, which is kind of cool.
I had a question. I don't have any feedback. I thought you brought out my emotions, all of them, really well in your story. My question about framing the story is, would you suggest starting, if that were my story, would I start with describing how I'm in this community now of my past classmates from uni? However, the reason this community has come together is a little bit darker than an explained story, kind of to loop in the end in the beginning and then just tell the history behind it. So recently I've been connected to my university friends. We've been chatting a lot, but it hasn't always been like this, and this is why. Would you recommend that?
That is definitely worth an experiment, for sure. I think, especially to Kara's earlier point about when you're sharing a story of a trauma story in some ways, the audience can appreciate knowing that you as the storyteller are quote unquote okay now, right? And so that is a way to bring that forward as an experiment. You can see it might also simultaneously diminish the power of the story. So you can kind of see which you can play with it both ways and see how it lands.
Partly you would want to balance how much context you have to provide at the beginning of a story. You don't want to spend too much time there, because it's like we want to spend more time there. This is why stories get long. But it's not necessarily like any of the details are very relevant or that people will remember them. But you do want to share the relevant details. And one other way to think about it would be, well, when is the first time that it becomes relevant to the story? So maybe it's when your mother is asking about, might you have known anybody else on the flight? And you could think about, okay, like there's this community and this community and this community, but haven't thought about them, but like maybe that's when you bring it in. Maybe it's when you see the names on the list. There's probably a few different places when that information becomes relevant, and then you can share the bits of the information that are relevant and avoid sharing something that we don't have a place to put in our head yet.
Yeah. And again, it comes back to your theme, right? If your theme is about how this trauma created community, then you're going to want to be able to drip your community, your experience with that community throughout your story. And
right.
That's like the drip that you're going to try to focus on. I know we only have 4 minutes, so I wanted to answer your question, Arman, about how do you even find stories? And I think in particular, it's interesting because we do have engage emotion as the theme, but that doesn't necessarily mean that your story itself has to be an experience that was a high emotion experience. We actually have... I worked once with a storyteller who was working on a story about how she got lost on the highway, right? And that is not a trauma story. She like got lost and then she was fine. But you can still bring in the emotional components of the experience. You can still describe the physiology. You can still talk about what you saw, what you heard, what you smelled, what you tasted, as a way to increase the emotional sort of stakes of the story, even if the story itself isn't a high emotional story. And so my guess is that you were thinking to yourself, oh, the theme is engage emotion. I need to tell a story that is a high emotion experience. And that's not true, right? We had a girl talking about adopting a cat, right? And like the emotional experience of adopting a cat, but the point is that she went really deep into what did the emotional experience feel like, even if it is happy emotions or emotions of excitement or whatever. But then to kind of roll back with that comment, I then say to you, don't judge your stories. Your stories, you have a million. You have so many. There's so many. You can tell a story about how you got to work today, right? There's a story in every experience that you live.
I walked from bedroom to living room for my work today. There's not a whole lot of story there.
All right, fine. But generally, when we talk about developing a story library and creating for yourself a list of stories that you can pull from, it is very much about developing a routine of reflection. And so whether you journal, whether you sit down once a week and say, what did I learn this week? What's a celebration? What's a lesson learned? It's about having a habit of reflection that will then generate for you stories over time.
Yeah.
Kara, do you
I
have
do
any...
it professionally, but yeah, for personal stories, that would be helpful. I do it professionally, like in my professional career, I say, this thing happened, I learned this. I went to this meeting, I learned this, but I never do it in personal life. So that's a new
so that's
habit for me.
Kara, would you add anything in the last minute about
I think it can be helpful to think about transition moments. It can be helpful to think about moments where you were making a decision. Those are all right for story. I like to think about travel experiences. Like something like that lends itself to metaphor. And and memory, like, are you climbing a mountain emotionally and literally climbing a mountain? So there's just some pieces of travel experiences that lend themselves well to storytelling. But yeah, like an obvious place, the thing that people go to emotional moments is because it's vivid for them, right? So it is a good place to go to for stories, but there are stories everywhere. So it's kind of like, where do you begin? And then, keep building that story library.
Thank you all for being here. It's been a lovely hour. Come again.
Visit wolfandheron.com to find out more about our story hours.